Today's session is on Jephthah and Jephthah's daughter in Judges 11, 1 to 40. Let's start out by reading Judges 11, 1 to 11, and then 29 to 40. And hopefully you've read verses 12 to 28 in preparation for class. As you're reading this, be thinking about the following questions. Who are the characters? What happens in this text? And what positive challenges and theological difficulties does this story present to people that you might know, and yourselves as well? Let's take 10 minutes in small groups to discuss this, spending most of your time on the last section. All right, so who are the characters? Well, we have Jephthah, Gilead, Gilead's wife, empty men. Some translations have worthless fellows, but literally the term means empty men. Sons of Ammon, the elders of Gilead, the king of the sons of Ammon, the Spirit of the Lord, is Jephthah's daughter, and her companions, and then the daughters of Israel. I think that covers all of them. What happens in this text? Well, it starts out with Jephthah being presented as a valiant warrior and as the son of a harlot, both in the same sentence. Jephthah's father's sons are described as driving him away, and he ends up in the town of Tob, which actually means good. Jephthah gathers these empty men around him, and then the sons of Ammon are described as coming out to fight against Israel, and that provokes the elders of Israel of Gilead to seek Jephthah's help, since he's a valiant warrior, and they make an offer. They appear to agree to make him a head chief, but eventually, and then we see him negotiating with the king of the sons of Ammon, but the king disregards his message. In the next section, verses 29 to 40, we see the Spirit of the Lord coming upon Jephthah, and then he makes this vow, and Jephthah then fights, and the Lord gives them victory. He comes back from his battle victory, and his daughter, his only daughter, comes to meet him, and so she's the one that he's to sacrifice. He's grief-stricken, but appears to be fatalistic. She insists that he fulfill the vow, asks 2 months of time for mourning. She remains a virgin, and then after 2 months with her companions, he apparently sacrificed her, but there's some lack of clarity there, which we'll see later. And then the women commemorate 4 months of every year. All right, so what would be some initial positive challenges? Well, we see that Jephthah is embraced even though he's the son of a prostitute. Although, how positive really is that? He confronts his rejectors with the truth. He then demonstrates pretty exemplary diplomacy in that section from verse 12 to 28. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah before he's accomplished anything, before he's given Israel victory. There appears to be an act of grace. Jephthah then wins the battle. I guess that's good. So what about some theological difficulties? I mean, these are some of the ones that I came up with. He makes a voluntary vow. That's problematic. Why would he do that? Why would he put conditions or make an offer that isn't being asked of him? Reminds me of Cain in a way, doesn't it? Cain gives a sacrifice to the Lord that the Lord never asked for. Is he required by God to fulfill the vow, even if it means sacrificing his only daughter? It seems that that's his theology, and that's her theology. So, for me, it's problematic that the Spirit of the Lord empowers him to slaughter enemies, especially in the light of the New Testament teachings on love of enemies. Jephthah's daughter describes this as an act of vengeance, and she comes out with tambourines to celebrate it. That's also difficult in the light of Paul's teachings about loving enemies and how vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord doesn't keep Jephthah from offering the daughter, apparently. Why? If human sacrifice is not prohibited, is prohibited by the Torah. There's no comment from the narrator or from God. Jephthah's daughter is commemorated by the daughters of Israel. Why? Is she commemorated as a noble one who's willing to agree with a sacrifice that goes against the Torah? What's that about? Does this legitimate human sacrifice to the Lord? All right, well, these are big questions, and one of the best ways to answer those questions is actually to look at the immediate literary context. It's always a good idea to, after you've determined your text, to then go back and look at like what immediately precedes it. So Judges 11 is preceded by Judges 10. How does Judges 10 contribute to our understanding of Judges 11? One of the things we see in Judges 10 is much of just this pattern that is throughout the book of Judges, where Israel is described as crying out to the Lord. Israel's a slave. She cries out to the Lord. God listens and is compassionate, raises up a judge. Israel's delivered. The judge dies. Well, actually, first of all, Israel begins to serve the Lord, and then usually the judge dies and Israel immediately falls into idolatry, and then is enslaved again, given over to the enemies by the Lord. But Israel cries out to the Lord. In chapter 10, it's brilliant the way that cycle is described. There's a theological preface which describes this pattern of falling into idolatry. The sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then this list of all these gods, these false gods, with this emphasis on how they forsook the Lord and did not serve him. So the Lord is angry. He sells the Philistines. He sells them to the Philistines and the sons of Ammon. And then we have this description of Israel being afflicted and crushed, which evokes the language of the Egyptian enslavement. The sons of Ammon then cross over. Israel cries out, "We've sinned." And in this beautiful statement in verses 11 to 15, the Lord can't stand to the people's crying out anymore, and so the people do put away their foreign gods and they serve the Lord. And there it is, verse 16. The Lord couldn't bear the misery of Israel any longer. The sons of Ammon then come against the sons of Israel, and the people say, "Who is the man who will begin to fight against the sons of Ammon?" And this is where it's all set up for us to meet Mr. Jephthah. So let's look, though, at a little background for the book of Judges. 11th century, the sons of Ammon, they became a kingdom. They oppressed the Israelites. The Judges is written from this Deuteronomistic tradition. So this is the same source as the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua, and then later 1 Kings and 2 Kings. So this is sort of the center of that whole body of literature that's written by a similar theological team or school. The Deuteronomist is very insistent on a careful observation of the Torah. So Deuteronomy 8, all the commandments that I'm commanding you today, you should be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. This kind of a statement appears all through this body of literature. Deuteronomist warns people that if they do not observe these commandments and follow the voice of the Lord, so it's more than just obeying commandments, it's actually being in a living relationship with the Lord and listening to his voice, then there will be a withholding of protection, and which could be understood as being punished. And God always allows other nations that are warring against Israel to be the agents of discipline. So here's a map of Canaan during the time of the Judges. We can see Gilead there, and where the Ammonites led the sons of Ammon. And we see that the sons of Ammon, were coming into Israel from the east, into this region where where Jephthah was. All right, so let's look a little closer now into the actual text. So the sons of Ammon camp at Gilead, and the leaders say, "Who's the man who will begin to fight?" And then we have Jephthah presented. It's interesting that Gilead was his father, but Gilead is also the name of the region, isn't it? So is this meant to be read as sort of a symbolic name, like like Jephthah is the son of sort of the namesake or the principality of the region, which is an area that is in chaos. Jephthah is rejected and excluded in this story by the legitimate sons who seek to disinherit him. And the language that is used is very theological. Garash is the main term that's used to describe the Lord driving out the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites. It begins with just the Lord driving out the man and the woman from the garden. Okay, but if we look at Exodus, especially Exodus 23 and then Joshua and Judges, it's a theological term. So the reader, we as readers, are meant to be interpreting the sons of Gilead, the legitimate sons, their rejection and their exclusion as theological. Okay, it's the same action as casting out the bad guys, the enemies of the kingdom. The term exile, he fled, is also highly theological. We see that same verb, barak, is used to describe Hagar fleeing, Jacob fleeing, Moses, Israel, Jotham. And so we as readers are invited to ponder this quandary of a theological term being used to exclude somebody, but then a theological term being used to describe their departure. Okay, so we're alerted to Jephthah having some kind of value, even though the sons of the kingdom, so to speak, don't recognize it. Jephthah gathers a community of the damned around him, and they're described in using the graphic sort of Hebrew verb as being empty men. And they went out with him, so it looks like a gang, criminal organization. Apparently, this gave him a reputation as someone who was to be feared and who was maybe needed, when times of trouble come to the insider community. So it's important to just, as we read a text, to try to really focus in on the essential elements, which I've outlined here with these arrows. All right, so the next section, verses 4 to 11, offers sort of a kind of an embrace that the insider community needs the outsider, and so and that's provoked by the sons of Ammon fighting, and so suddenly the elders of Gilead are feeling threatened, and they need this guy who they cast out, so they go get him. Come and be our chief. Here a term kazin is used, which is like captain, and it's not a really common term. It's not the most common term for a leader. Jephthah tells the elders that they had been excluders, doesn't he? He says, "Did you not hate me and drive me from my father's house? So why have you come to me now when you're in trouble?" I've read this text in the jail recently with the men, and when we get to this point where we read what the elders say, "Come and be our chief, that we might fight against the son of Ammon," and I asked the inmates, most of whom have had experiences of rejection and are really marked in many ways by rejection. How they would react. They say, "Oh, no way, I wouldn't go. I mean, why would I go and help them fight against their enemies when they, when they hadn't treated me with any kind of respect, and they just dishonored me and rejected me." So that leads to some interesting discussion, and really alerted me to this text being perhaps primarily about a rejected one, a rejected man on the margins, and a reflection, a presentation, a theological presentation of what constitutes sort of an inadequate embrace. So it's powerful here that Jephthah is able to speak. He demonstrates himself as a capable negotiator in a way. The elders also are exemplary because they use a diplomacy. They describe. They offer to make him head. They respond by saying, "For this reason we've come now and returned to you, that you may go with us." See, we have that future. That you may go with this expression of inclusion and fight. So first the expression of inclusion, then what they really need him for is fighting, and then this conditional description of becoming a head. They don't offer to make him head, at least Rosh, which is a more serious sort of leader term. He says, you will become head over all the inhabitants of Gilead. It's like they're adding bait to the offer, aren't they? First he says, come and be our chief. They're offering to make him a captain, but right then and there. But then this second sort of offer is like become, more than a chief, become head. And not only over us who are the battlers, but over all the inhabitants of Gilead. Now Jephthah in this text, does he express like total trust? Apparently, what from my read of this, it looks like he shows a lot of distrust. He accepts conditionally. He's bargaining. He says, "If you take me back to fight," and notice he doesn't add he doesn't add the "with you." When earlier they said, "Come to fight with us," which shows the distrust. So if you take me back to fight, and the Lord gives them up to me. Okay, he brings in something that they hadn't even mentioned. Will I become your head? In some ways, is Jephthah making his headship even more difficult than what they're suggesting? Or how do you read that? Now the elders at this point continue to use the negotiation. They're very, very. There's a brilliance here, and they bring in the Lord. Jephthah's already brought in the Lord, so that gives them permission to bring in the Lord. And they say, "The Lord is witness between us. Surely we will do as you have said." So this future, in a way, that the elders make out really good in this bargain, because it's all up to the Lord, and if the Lord actually achieves this, then after this thing has been achieved, then the headship is offered. And so the Jephthah apparently is won over by this, by the use of the name of the Lord, which shows his own vulnerability in terms of being an outsider from the religious community. He'd been driven out, perhaps like the Canaanites, like the Hittites, and everybody. But now if the Lord actually gives him victory, that gives him some kind of insurance, and them, because he stated this publicly. But it also sets him up to have to work out his righteousness. It puts pressure on him to have to perform. It's a performance setup, isn't it? So then Jephthah went with, and it looks like some sort of adoption, a very conditional one, is happening here. But then the people, interestingly, go far beyond the elders. They enthusiastically embrace Jephthah, and they actually make him head and chief. Okay, and starting with head, and then chief over them. And so he's already offered everything. He gets everything before he's performed, doesn't he? Which is really what grace is about. And we'll see whether that's enough for him, or whether he is so broken and so marked by rejection that that he's unable to accept this and what comes later. So Jephthah speaks all his words before the Lord, in terms of his agreement, which once again puts him in a situation of having to perform. So once again, it's important to be able to, as you read different texts, to be able to take note of the critical pieces, places, and to spend your time reflecting on that. A quick structural observation here. If you just look at this, perhaps when you have more time, you can see that at the beginning, chapter 11, verse 1 to 4, Jephthah is driven away by the sons of Gilead, and then at the end, Jephthah's daughter is embraced and commemorated by the daughters of Israel. That's kind of a contrast, rejection and commemoration. Mark the the beginning and the end of this whole kind of pericope. The elders recruit and excluded Jephthah and negotiate with him, and they vow, and then down below, kind of in contrast and in opposition, Jephthah fulfills a vow, doesn't he? In verse 39. Chapter 11, verse 11, the people make Jephthah head and chief before he succeeds. In 36, Jephthah's daughter agrees with Jephthah's vow, which is that conditional, vow that Jephthah puts in, but she adds a condition as well. I need 2 months. And then in the section, verse 12 to 28, Jephthah tries and fails to negotiate. But then in verse 32, which is the other side of that inclusio, the Lord gave the sons of Ammon into Jephthah's hands. And then the two that are side by side, verse 29 and verse 30, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Jephthah before success, totally unconditionally. And then right in contrast to that, right next to it is Jephthah making a conditional vow. So often when we read text, this is very helpful to do, to kind of set out everything, like on a computer screen, or just to write it out and to try to look for contrasts, oppositions, similarities. Usually biblical texts are written in a way where we can see these kinds of oppositions. So why did Jephthah make the vow? Looks like Jephthah wanted to obtain God's help in a way for the victory, so that he would deserve the unmerited favor. Okay, so he says, I will do this, almost as a way to kind of guarantee something that was already offered freely. Is it possible that Jephthah, as sort of an outsider, excluded one, son of a prostitute, is he trying to gain divine favor by adding an extra requirement? What do you think about that? Do we do that kind of thing today? Do Christians in Western countries, the UK, North America, do we have that tendency to add extra requirements, when we're feeling anxious about whether a promise is actually going to be fulfilled that God gives us? Why don't you take a few minutes just to discuss this? What image of God and of himself does Jephthah have? Let's just take a few minutes to think about that as well. Just maybe pause this for a minute or two. One thing we can say is that God's miraculous help is not believed to be freely given, apparently, from Jephthah's action. Could this be suggesting that God helps those who make extraordinary sacrifices? God's powerful, but we must negotiate with him for benefits, and that involves, us being willing to make sacrifices. God only helps if we beg, seems to be underlying Jephthah's vow. In terms of his own self-esteem, it appears that he doesn't feel unconditionally accepted, does he? So acceptance must be merited. Or does it? Orphan spirit? This notion of the orphan spirit is that, when you're an orphan, if you haven't had an experience of acceptance, if you've been marked by not having, a father or a mother, perhaps, being an orphan is many orphans have that experience of lack, of like wondering, well, what did I do wrong? Why? Guilt and shame around their status as not belonging. Do we see these attitudes, these images of God in ourselves and in our community? Do these ways of viewing God and viewing self continue around us? Yeah, why don't you take a couple minutes to discuss that? So if we look at vows in the Old Testament context, we can see that vows were viewed as words that needed to be fulfilled. Okay, so and there's even this kind of a warning: if you refrain from vowing, it would not be a sin to you. So there's a suggestion that it's better not to vow, but if you do, be careful to perform, what does come out of your lips. So this kind of a text could provide sort of a basis for Jephthah saying, "Oh well, I've done it, and now I'm stuck. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to bind himself with a binding obligation, he shall not violate his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." And yet, in verse 3, if a woman makes a vow to the Lord and binds herself, and her father hears her vow and her obligation, and he says nothing to her, then all her vows shall stand. So apparently, if Jephthah's daughter had disagreed, then, or if Jephthah had not agreed with her daughter's agreement, that this whole thing could have been stopped. So perhaps there's a loophole here. Could Jephthah have stopped this whole thing, or her daughter? If we look at Jesus' teachings on this, Jesus says, "I said you make no oath at all. Let your yes be yes, your no be no. Anything beyond these is of evil." If we look at human sacrifice in the Old Testament, it's prohibited. Okay, so here we have two sort of traditions that are in odds, in opposition to each other. On the one hand, you're supposed to fulfill your vows, but yet you're not supposed to give your offspring to Moloch. Okay, that was a common practice during the Old Testament times, was human sacrifice. Of course, this isn't. These texts describe, giving sacrifices to Moloch, but here we're talking about the Lord, and yet we see in Jeremiah that giving sacrifices to the Lord is also prohibited. It's described as a detestable thing. Therefore, there shall not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, one who uses divination, who practices witchcraft. Here, this one is even more clear. It's Jeremiah 7:31. God says He never commanded, and this didn't even come to His mind, this idea of burning your sons and your daughters in the fire. So we have a prohibition of human sacrifice that counters, or that which one trumps the other. Anyway, so let's look at Jephthah's return. So Jephthah returns, and his daughter is elated and comes with tambourines and dancing, much like troops are welcomed, back in the United States, back into the UK today. The text emphasizes now that she was his one and only child. Besides her, he had no son or daughter. Which really emphasizes the tragedy of this story, doesn't it? So when he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter." So immediate reaction is shock and public expression of grief. And then this sort of strange statement: "You have brought me very low. You are among those who trouble me," which many interpreters have stated expresses Jephthah's blaming of his daughter, which I'm not so sure is accurate. What is the meaning of Jephthah's response? Is it a blaming of his daughter, who's the first one to come out, instead of his dog or little goat or something? One thing that's really struck me is just seeing her patriotism as sort of occasioning her sacrifice. Okay, she comes out like many family members of soldiers, and all excited and supportive, and because she hasn't had to be out on the front lines, maybe wants to express her willingness to make sacrifices too. Since his victory is interpreted as directly linked to his vow, sort of a payment, does she see him as trapped in a legal bargain, which she's also kind of willing to participate in. So could the daughter here be complicit with the father, submitting herself to his vow and to his theology? She says, "My father, you've given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you have said, since the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the sons of Ammon." This term, the Lord avenging Jephthah of his enemies, rather than our enemies, seems to suggest the daughter's solidarity with her father, who she's aware is a person who'd been marked by rejection, and so she herself is of a rejected family, and so perhaps her own desire to guarantee the acceptance which she recognizes is fought for, is behind her embrace of her own participation. So could she be expressing a vengeance mindset that even goes beyond her father? Is she committed to protecting the acceptance that her father has sort of won, even though that acceptance in many ways could be viewed as given by grace? It's interesting that the elders of Gilead's enemies have suddenly become Jephthah's enemies, at least according to the daughter, and so she views him as having really become a full-on member and a supporter, a defender of the larger macro system of domination. So what does this look like today? In what way does our larger culture and family end up supporting our theologies and our practices? In what way does our agreement with the fanfare of troops returning home from the battlefield, troops engaging in battles that are really questionable, in what way do we continue the myth of redemptive violence and even willingly engage in a system of sacrifice, of child sacrifice, of human sacrifice? What do you think about this? It's interesting, just looking for scriptures that can help us deal with this story, rather than living by the word that comes out of Jephthah's mouth. This is a scripture that I wish that Jephthah's daughter had on hand. Man does not live by bread alone, but man lives and woman lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. It's what comes out of the mouth of the Lord that leads to life, and in this case, what comes out of Jephthah's mouth leads to death. Vengeance is mine; I will repay, says the Lord. If we look at sacrifice in the New Testament, we see that Jesus comes and offers himself as a ransom for many. And the question of who that ransom is given to is a complicated one. But when we read that in the light of Jesus' final supper, his Passover supper celebration on the eve of his arrest and crucifixion, we see that Jesus actually gives his body and his blood, not to God and not to his captors, but to his own disciples. It's we, the followers of Jesus, who need his own his being, his body, his blood. God demonstrates his own love towards us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So we see that that God has sacrificed himself, which makes other sorts of sacrifices unnecessary. At least us sacrificing to achieve the salvation of our own. Christ died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, in order that he might bring us to God. So the aftermath of this text looks like the father agrees with her agreement. She said to her father, "Let this thing be done to me," and let me alone 2 months, and let me go into the mountains and weep for my virginity. Because of my virginity, I and my companions. And so he says, go. And then when she comes back, he fulfills the vow. And so the result, early death, no descendant for Jephthah, because that's his one and only daughter. So the result is that this excluded one ends up, not continuing into the future. His lineage is cut off, isn't it? And who does that remind you of? So one question comes up: did Jephthah sacrifice his daughter? Says that she went away to weep her virginity. It doesn't say that she went away to weep her impending death, does it? And then in verse 9, it emphasizes that she went and did according to the vow which she'd made. Which vow did she make? To go away for 2 months and mourn her virginity, or to be consecrated to the Lord as a virgin. What we're left with is this description of her not having a relationship with a man. So did he in the end consecrate her to the Lord, but not actually sacrifice her? I mean, the text does seem to focus on her not having a relationship with a man. So this question has really perplexed lots of theologians, and especially Jewish exegetes in the Middle Ages. Radak, David Kimchi, who was a middle-aged, someone in the Middle Ages who was a Jewish rabbi, he states in the name of his father Joseph that the vav, which is at the beginning of this phrase where it says, "And I will offer up as a burnt offering," can be understood as conditional. So if, in other words, if this is an appropriate sacrifice, it will be a burnt offering. But if not, it would be consecrated to God. This is an exegetical attempt that isn't impossible, that some people use to describe Jephthah's daughter as actually becoming one of the first anchorites, one of the first female mystics who became like a nun. So Jephthah in the New Testament. Jephthah in Hebrews is described as as a person of faith who conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises. There's no mention of this lack of faith that is expressed through this vow, which is interesting. Why wouldn't the writer of Hebrews been more careful to note the ambiguity or the difficulty here? We do see this notion of sacrifice being valuable, but Paul describes us as offering our bodies as a living sacrifice, not a dead sacrifice. So we are called to give ourselves over fully, aren't we? We see that God gives the firstborn for the salvation, his firstborn son for the salvation of the world. And all this language of the firstborn reminds us of that. So a lot of biblical scholars also point out the comparisons between this story and Genesis 22, which I'll just leave you to look at. They're actually quite different stories. It's God who asks Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and we have this is a case where where God the Lord ends up showing up, the angel of the Lord ends up showing up and actually stopping Abraham, and yet in contrast we have Jephthah, who isn't asked to offer his daughter, and but just offers through a vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house, and which he does. And so anyway, these contrasts are maybe valuable, but really the way I'd like to end our time here is just asking this question: if you could go to Jephthah and to his men in Tob before the elders of Gilead got to him, how could you prepare him for this, for the story that would follow? What would you say to him and to his men in order to warn him? I'm going to be I want to introduce you to a number of men who are going to be sharing their own reaction, their own response to this question in the slide that follows, in the video clip that follows. But this is a really important question for us to be considering. In our communities, there are many people whose lives have been marked by rejection. How do we reach out to them and offer healing? One thing that seems clear is that true embrace must be without conditions. It's not dependent upon our need of someone or their compliance, with things that they've said or obligations. Finally, I believe that some of these scriptures really offer hope and show us how Jesus himself, as the rejected one, heals us through, by means of our rejection of him. Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and raised up on the third day. It's Jesus himself who identifies, with the rejected one, with rejection. He himself is rejected. And in this text, in the verses that follow, which I just invite you to take away with you back to your homes after this class period, Jesus goes on to express in verse 23, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. So this idea of moving into Jesus' company is identifying or being willing to be rejected, to throw our lot in with the rejected one. Whoever wishes to save his life, verse 24, will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, this one is the one who will save it. And so, anyway, let's close with a prayer. Lord, we just ask that you would give us guidance, and as we really contemplate what it means to receive your acceptance of us by grace, and also to be able to carry that acceptance to the people that are marked as rejected. We pray for your help and your guidance, and that you'd alert us to rejected ones that need a word of embrace, and show us, Lord, how we can counter this dominant theology that places grace as really a prize to be earned. Lord, help us to be able to step into a new level of life in what we can fully accept your acceptance. I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Yelling in my ear saying that I'm not worthy.
Yeah. So say that one more time. What would heal the wound of rejection? What did for you?
Jesus and the people in the building in this church is just being able to, even though I was still screwing up, still out using drugs, these people just loved me for who I was and continually to love me, unconditionally, and that just brought, it was able to keep lifting me up, knowing that, hey, these people accept me for who I am.
So they didn't just love you because they needed you to do something?
No, they love me because they love me. Yeah.
Yeah. So it doesn't really work to love someone because you need them to do something.
That's not love.
Yeah.
And to accept people where they're at and to see them as a child of God rather than to see their sin. When you see their sin, it convicts them. And when you see them as a child of God, it empowers them, and that's what we need to be doing, is empowering people with that unconditional acceptance,
Yeah,
because I still have rejection issues, and I'm still dealing with it. Go ahead, sir.
I think if we love people because of what they can offer us as a church or a ministry, like you have these leadership abilities, or you have these administrative abilities, or you have all these things, and we need all your things, so we love you. It's like, it's got to be unconditional love. I mean, we can totally put conditions on. It's like, well, we only love you because.
So if people feel like they're being embraced because they're needed, then that puts them in a performance mindset. Yeah.
Yeah, huge, because it hugely speaks love to me in this building, being a remodeler, that I'm not sucked into building maintenance all the time.
Plus,
and
if somebody
it's like, oh, we love you because your calling must be a a maintenance guy.
And if somebody's rejected by the church, what do they have to ever go back to? You know what I mean? Like if there ever could be hope again, it should be through the church. And if they're rejected by the church, which most of the people who are out there homeless on the street who don't want to be well, that's a big part of the reason why. You know, why should they want to be well? You know,
So
who
they can
really
hand out
cares?
options.
Yeah, people just love me for what I can do for them, not for who I am. You know.
Hmm.
And it only takes one church to
do that.
to do that, because they could say, well, you know, well, where's your family? You know, instead of saying, well, we can help you this way or we can help you that way. You know, we can't give you money, but we can actually get you food, or we can get you a place to stay tonight, things like that. Instead of saying, well, what can your family do for you instead of us?
Right.
And you know, I've been in that position, but
So,
it wasn't-
yeah, go ahead, sorry.
and it wasn't a good feeling to be, you know, you come to a church for help and they tell you basically, well, why can't your family help you?
Because you believe you're coming to God.
Right, right. And then, you know, and I've had that happen to me. And it's not a good feeling, because then, you know, then you're afraid to go to the next one to see what happens.
That's right.
But I didn't. I continued to.
Because then you get more rejection, more rejection, more rejection.
Right.
So what Jephthah needed wasn't to be recruited to become a leader based on his success at winning, this war against these threatening enemies, the sons of Ammon. What Jephthah needed was
Acceptance,
Yeah.
love, unconditional, not to be driven out.
And he already had that. By the people that were already surrounding him, they just were empty. But he was their leader.
right.
You know.
Yeah.
So what he was building and what was, maybe not pure, but it was as good as he could do. It wasn't good enough for him. You know.
Right. So that's why he made that vow.
All right. Thanks, you guys.